So it's come up several times in so far in this discussion, which is the idea that modern people typically lack a genuine rite of passage. A rite of passage is a natural expectation of the human soul, and it's something that's been lost. And so we're all missing typically this experience where we're separated from everybody, and then we go into a descent into darkness of some kind. Someone is put into a dark hut somewhere. Sometimes people are actually partially buried, or someone is put inside the hollow center, a trunk of an old tree. If someone is in a cave, someone is on a vision quest exposed on a mountainside. All these different things would be done in order to expose the person to nature on one hand, but also to the cosmos on another level. And the point of it was to have a vision, to have an awakening, to have, in a sense, a calling that tells them who they are already. Not who they're going to become simply, but who they already are. And so if a person was born into a certain kind of indigenous tribe, then that would involve typically an animal, which becomes then the totem animal or the guiding animal, that kind of the guiding spirit. Those kind of things were the ways in which people encountered calling, typically during times of youth. And that has kind of disappeared from modern culture, but the archetypal sense of it can't disappear. Young people are crashing into the world, driving cars too fast, trying drugs, experimenting with all kinds of things in order to find that which they haven't found yet, which turns out to be a connection to their own inner spirit and their own depth of soul. And so often people are missing the second birth, which is the birth that is out of childhood. And in that sense, going back to the question earlier, they used to refer to the childhood as dying. And the person was then going to live from that phase into the next phase. And the next phase would involve dreams and visions, awakening experiences that are all connected to finding, having, and enacting a calling in life. So the birth of genius, or the birth of the genius self, you could call it, is part of a second birth that is typically absent in terms of formal process in the modern world. And yet it's an archetypal element of the soul, and it can't disappear. So you can go back and look through your own life at critical periods, and if you look with the eye of imagination or the eye of initiation, you can see how certain things were as if vision quests, as if death and rebirth experiences. And I sometimes get concerned about telling this too much, but I've also written about it. And what got me started studying all these things was winding up in solitary confinement in a prison during the 60s, related to not being willing to fight in the Vietnam War kind of thing. But the important part of it was that I wound up isolated in a small cell, separate from everyone I loved, everyone I knew, and everything I expected. And instead of disappearing or just, melting into depression and despair, I found something inside myself that was alive and that was connected, in my case, to mythological stories. As if those stories were not just interesting things, they were alive in me. They actually saved me in that experience. And that gave me this sense of what you could get in a vision quest. In other words, I died in that cell. The me that entered the cell is not the me that came out of the cell. And the one who came out of the cell was now connected. This one part of it that makes sense in terms of calling was now connected to mythology at a cellular, embodied level. And then from that, I eventually realized, that's what I'm called to do, to work in the area of mythology and stories and imagination. So I'm just giving that as one example. But that example includes the fact that everything had to be stripped away before I could have that experience and feel that deeply enough to transform or change from the person I had been to this other person that was waiting, or this other part of myself that was waiting to awaken. So I'm not saying it always has to be that dramatic. I'm saying look at those parts of one's life and you see the potential connection to unfinished initiatory experiences or to unfinished responses to a calling that has been trying to call all along. Excuse me. The getting a connection to this inner sense of genius or daimon gives a person an inner authority. When I was growing up, we were warned not to respect authority figures, and there's some sense in that. But there is an authority figure that really is important to respect. That is to say, the inner authority of our own soul. And the word authority begins with the word author. So that is to say, when we understand what's trying to live through us, what we came here to live, then we become closer to being an assistant author in the making of our own lives. But we also become closer to having some sense of inner authority, which is really important when the outside world makes no sense. We have to draw a sense of authority from somewhere, and this connection between the inner genius or daimon and the calling of one's life brings with it a kind of inner authority. And I'm using authority in its old sense, meaning the capacity to create and to add to life, rather than the capacity to dominate people, which is the misadventure and the misunderstanding and the misuse of authority in the contemporary world. And just to say, connected to that is the idea that the inner genius, the part of us that responds to the calling, will also drive us to do the hardest things we could possibly do and even thought we couldn't do. I'm repeating, the genius is not an aspect of the human person per se. It's spirit. And so it doesn't feel the need to stop and eat. Like the painter who has a show coming and paints for days and days and doesn't sleep and doesn't eat. That's genius driving the person to express fully. And so one first problem was we haven't found the genius. The second problem is we found it, and now we have to figure out how to live with it. The first problem is we haven't found the calling. The second problem is we have found it, and now we have to find ways to respond to something that is much greater than ourselves in terms of vitality and in terms of a drive to express. And so the responding to the call puts us on a potential road of great vitality and great creativity, but it can be very demanding. And so then there has to be what's called negotiating with the spirit or negotiating with the genius. I'm repeating because it's not simply a human aspect, it's also a spiritual presence. I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier. In growing older, the way that a person remains vital, exercise is good balance and nutrition is good, meditation is good, having friends is good. There's all kinds of things that are good. But what keeps a person young inside, which is a very common notion that a person can be old on the outside, young inside, what keeps a person young inside is a connection to the genius or the daimon, the inner spirit that was there at the very beginning. That's what keeps us young when we're old. And as a matter of fact, it was the connection to that inner spirit that from which came the idea of the fountain of youth. The fountain of youth doesn't exist somewhere. It exists inside. It's the ever-flowing fountain of imagination, ideas, and emotions that we can naturally have access to. And so I'm just saying, for those of us that are growing older, the body has its aches and its pains and its growing incapacities, but the inner essence, the daimon, the inner spirit, and the genius is not affected or limited by those. And so a person can have a very vital inner life while actually experiencing a diminishing of life in other ways. And connected to that, I want to say one more thing, which is that there can be more than one calling in life. And if a person hasn't experienced the calling, then please know that the calling keeps calling. In other words, the calling is so important for the awakening of the soul of the person that it keeps calling all the way to the end. And there are stories of people on their deathbed realizing what the calling was. And I'm just putting that there as a way of encouragement. Vocation or calling doesn't simply mean identifying the path or the kind of work. It also means learning one's unique style of performing the work, right? So the vocation isn't simply, oh, I'm going to become an artist, or oh, I'm going to become a healer, or oh, I'm going to become a psychologist. That is part of the calling, but the vocation includes the unique style in which and by which the person does the work. And that's what distinguishes one person from another and one vocation from another. Maybe it's also important to say responding to the call or to the vocation gives a person a purpose in life. And just like the genius is there at the very beginning, woven into the soul of the person, the purpose of a person is there at the beginning, woven into the heart of a person. The idea is not to find a purpose out there, it's to awaken to the purpose that's already inside. That purpose is aligned with one's spirit and aligns with one's calling. And maybe the last comment about this is genius, or the inner spirit of a person is by its nature resilient. So we live in these hard times where things can change, shocking things occur. It happens all the time now. It's going to continue to happen. We're in that kind of period. And one of the most, and possibly the most resilient thing in a person is the spirit that they were born with. The spirit that came into the world with us is endlessly resilient. So when the world is hard and we're feeling easily discouraged or something, one way to find some resiliency is to turn to the inner spirit insofar as we know it, to realign with the genius that we came into the world with, or as they used to say, the genius that brought us into the world. That realignment gives us a capacity for resiliency that we cannot find otherwise.